Welcome back to the Grand Point Church podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Stein, and we're continuing our Really series with today's message from Pastor Dan Culbertson. If you haven't picked up on it, we have a lot of exclamation marks and question marks after that word, and it's actually a little hard to say. In the scope of Joseph's life story, we have been taken on an incredible journey. It's one that would have left any person wondering about the reality of God's grace. How could Joseph have possibly endured the seemingly endless tragedy in his life? As we enter Genesis 41, we finally begin to see some relief for Joseph as something good begins to develop in his personal life. The Lord is beginning to show him public favor.
I think we all have times in our lives where we can relate to that, right? Where things just don't seem like they're going our way, or things just seem like they're not fair, they don't make sense, where we go through life and it seems like every step of the way we're running into something that just doesn't go our way. This whole series that we are in right now called Really is all about that. We're all about learning how to trust God in those times where things just don't make sense. Learning how to trust God in those times when we can't help but stop and go, really? In order to kind of tie all this together, we're actually using a key verse for this series. And the cool thing is this verse is used in the kids ministry. It's used in all of our other campuses and venues. And it's just a great opportunity for us to have just a single central point that we can use as this place of encouragement whenever we hit these moments in life. And for us in this series, that place is in Proverbs 3:5. So Proverbs 3:5 says, "Trust the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding." Trust the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. This is very much so what this whole series is about, is us in those times where things don't make sense, those things that we just can't understand are happening, we have something to grab onto. We know that we can trust in God, even in the middle of challenging and difficult circumstances. This morning, let's kind of start things off by talking about influencers. How many of you are familiar with that term, influencers? See, this has been around for a little while now. It kind of started with the advent of social media and with YouTube in particular. But right now, I think Instagram has a monopoly on it. You hear the term Instagram influencers all the time. And basically what this is an influencer is somebody who's able to leverage their following or just these people that know them or maybe think they're famous or any number of things, to leverage that relationship for influencing the culture around them, to influence popular culture. And this has actually led to some pretty cool things. In fact, there's been some positive impacts because of some of the influencers out there when it comes to social media. You see this awareness of certain kind of social things. Specifically, you get all of these different issues that are real like kind of isolated things that can be lifted up, and now people have attention brought to those situations. They've helped raise money for charities. They help kind of provide some positive effects within the world. And some of that's just centered around the reality of their content creators. They create things that tend to be entertainment, things that we can connect to and we can learn from, and sometimes they can be inspiring, sometimes they can be positive things. In fact, in my personal life, I have actually had just recently, within the beginning of this year, I started this kind of new thing in my life of getting up really early. And that was purely because a guy that I enjoyed watching on YouTube, mostly because he just created these really cool videos and stuff, inspired me to do so. Now, from his framework, it was all about productivity and doing more and getting more done, but for me, it became about spending more time with God. And so I was challenged and inspired from his thing to start that. And it's made a really huge impact on my life. There have been some real-world impacts that come out of influencers. Some of that real-world impact has actually come in the form of money, right? Because anytime something good is happening, someone wants to find a way to make money off of it. So you hear the term influencer marketing quite a bit now. And this isn't really anything new. We've always had like celebrity endorsements of products and things like that. But now you see corporations and businesses trying to leverage the pre-existing audience of an influencer in order to make money, basically, is what it amounts to. So this has led to being an influencer actually becoming a job. There are people who do social media for a living. They make money just being online and having a lot of friends. And through doing that, then, they're used to kind of peddle products or ideology or brand or any number of things. So that in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, but there's been a negative impact that's come out of that, because what ends up happening now is so many people want to strive towards that it just naturally has some negative things that come with that. I'm not sure if you all know this or not, but there is no filter on what you say or do on the internet, right? So what ends up happening is anyone can say or do anything to try and gain influence. And so they will throw out all of this stuff, and they will lean into all of this junk that isn't necessarily true in order to gain followers and to go through things. That's part of the reason why I think it's possible to find support for almost anything you believe online, right? It doesn't matter how based in reality it is or how truthful or based on fact it is. You can find somebody who agrees with you. But when you find that, then you can run with it, and it can lead to all sorts of other problems. We've seen some other things come out of these influencers that have been negative. Some of them have used their influence to bully other people, and so they mobilize their entire army of followers to do that. One of the other things that we've seen come out of it, especially with aspiring influencers, you get these people who are trying to kind of swindle free things out of local businesses and whatnot in exchange for exposure. They're kind of using their number of followers as a currency. So what will end up happening is they'll go, and actually there's a specific situation of this. One particular influencer wanted to throw a party for 300 of their followers. And so they went to an ice cream truck owner and said, hey, we're going to have this party with 300 people. We want you to give it to us for free. In return, we'll give you some exposure. Well, the ice cream truck owner had experienced some influencer issues already with people asking for handouts and for exposure, and so it led him to actually take the opposite stance in this situation, and he posted this sign on his truck: influencers pay double. So he was so sick of the whole situation that he's like, no, I'm not giving you anything for free. In fact, if you tell me you're an influencer, I'm going to charge you twice as much. The whole reason why I am talking about influencers so much right now is because every single one of us should be an influencer. Every one of us should be an influencer. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I don't mean that every single one of us should go out and get online and start posting everything that we think, say, do, eat online. In fact, there's probably some of us in the room that could stand to post just a little bit less. We don't need to put quite as much out there. But what I mean by this is every one of us should be an influencer in the various cultures and contexts and circles that we find ourselves in. Every one of us has the ability to impact people's lives around us. And so we should use our influence to help other people. Influencers are able to lead and guide and inspire people. And that's what we should be doing, especially those of us who have a relationship with God. We should be sharing God and influencing the world for God around us. And that's today's focus. We all have the power to influence the culture around us. When we trust in God and the various circumstances He puts us in, He can use those circumstances and use our lives to impact the world around us. I can tell some of you don't believe me. I can tell some of you are like, I don't have any influence. I don't connect with people. Think about this with me. How many people do you interact with on a daily basis? Maybe it's a spouse or significant other. Maybe it's your kids. Maybe it's coworkers. Maybe it's friends. Maybe it's complete strangers. Maybe it's the cashier at the store. Or maybe it's a waitress. Or maybe it's other customers. Just people you interact with. We have the ability to leave a mark on all of those people. We have the ability to make an impact to all those people. And I know it's not always the most comfortable thing, especially when it comes to strangers, but we have that ability. It's a natural thing for us. Let me give you an example of this. So for some reason recently, it seems like every time I go to Sheets, something absurd happens. I don't know what it is. Like I keep getting put in these weird and awkward situations, or there's just like uncomfortable interactions, and it's kind of funny how much it seems to localize around the sheets right down here on Norland. Like, it seems like that is the place where if I go there, I'm going to see something happen that's strange, or I'm going to have an interaction that's weird. I don't know what it is. There's this one night, in fact, it was right before rehearsal. I usually come in and help the team get started and work things out. And one night, I stopped for dinner before I came in here. And I grabbed my food, and I paid for it, and I checked out. And then I ended up leaving the store. And I was parked off to the left, and if any of you have been in that store, there's kind of a brick wall there, and then a corner that you can't see around, and my car was beyond that corner. I came out of Sheets, just kind of walking full speed, and cut real close to that corner, right at the exact same time that someone else was coming the opposite direction. And so we both pulled this like matrix move and dodged out of the way of each other. And I say, "Excuse me," and he looks at me and goes, "Excuse me, officer." And I did this like double take. I'm like, "Say what now?" And I turn, and the guy's gone. Like, he ghosted. Like, he knew what he said and went poof, smoke bomb. Because I in no way, shape, or form looked like an officer at that point in time. I'm wearing shorts and a T-shirt. Like, there's nothing there. It was just this one of those moments where his mouth moved faster than his brain, or maybe he was thinking about something. Who knows? As silly as this is, that guy had an impact on my life. As silly as that situation is. First off, I keep thinking about this situation. Like, it was so awkward and so strange and so out there that it keeps coming to my mind. Like, I'll just be hanging out at home, and all of a sudden I'm like, remember that guy at Sheets? That was weird. But then beyond that, guess what I don't do? I don't cut that corner short anymore. I don't walk too close to that corner whenever I'm leaving Sheets. See, as small and as silly as it is, he had an impact on my life. That short little interaction had an impact. Every single one of us has that natural ability to impact the lives around us. Side note, if you happen to be that guy, because I can't remember your face or anything like that, please know I'm not making fun of you, because we all say stupid things, and we all need to put our foot in our mouths sometimes, especially when our brain's not moving as fast as our mouth is. But there's obviously a positive thing for me. It might be small, but it's one of those things. Well, throughout this series, we've been looking at Joseph, right? And we've been looking at these different spots in his life. And he has shown us over and over again that God could use him to influence the world around him, even in the middle of ridiculous situations. Since each of us has that natural ability to connect people and to have influence with people and make an impact in people's lives, we're going to take a look at a specific story in Joseph's life today that reminds us that when we trust in God, he can use us to influence the world around us and make an impact and make a change for him and for the better. We've been walking through these different stages of his life where he's been dealing with all of these situations that don't make sense and all of these things that are hard and challenging, and they all just seem to happen to him. 90% of them aren't even his fault. And at any of these moments, I think any one of us would stop and go, really? Really? Is this what you have for us? Last week, we looked at Joseph and how he was able to trust God when he was in prison. And we talked about the importance of embracing our place, the importance of allowing God to use us no matter where we are. Joseph was faithful to God, and the reason why we have to kind of touch base on this story is because it's the direct precursor to the story we're going to look at today. See, Joseph was still faithful and trusting in God, even in the middle of prison. And even though he was faithful, Joseph was not removed from that situation immediately. In fact, it took 2 years before Joseph was actually removed from prison, when Joseph was able to be free from prison. If you recall, when we talked last week, Joseph, while he was in prison, happened to be paired up with some officials of Pharaoh. So he's in Egypt in prison, and Pharaoh got mad at 2 of his officials and sent them to jail. And so Joseph is with those 2 in jail, and God uses him to interpret some dreams that these 2 guys have. Well, when Joseph interprets their dreams, one of them, the cupbearer, he asked to remember him whenever the cupbearer is brought back into his position with Pharaoh. Because that's what the interpretation of the dream was. You are going to be put back in your position. And so the cupbearer forgets. And so for 2 years, Joseph stays in prison. So here we are, 2 years later. We're looking at Genesis 41. I'm going to be kind of barreling through this and really summarizing the vast majority of it. If you want to check out all the details, it's in Genesis 41. But at the beginning of Genesis 41, this is 2 years after this event where he's interpreting these officials' dreams, Pharaoh has a dream. In fact, he actually has 2 dreams. The first dream, there are 7 big fat cows that come out of the Nile River, followed by 7 skinny, ugly cows. And those 7 skinny and ugly cows proceed to devour those first set of cows. I don't know about you, but that would feel pretty much like a nightmare to me. That would be pretty terrifying, wouldn't it? Just all of a sudden have this dream where these cows are being eaten by other cows. It's kind of freaky. And so naturally, Pharaoh is shaken. He has a second dream that's similar about grains or stalks of grain that consume other stalks of grain. A little less scary. I don't think plants eating other plants is really as scary to us as a cow eating another cow would be. But either way, Pharaoh's so shaken up by this that the next morning he calls in all of his magicians and all of his wise men and he says, I want you to interpret this dream. He tells the dream to all of them and nobody can interpret the dream. Nobody knows what it means. And when they can't interpret the dream, he starts getting angry. And he starts throwing this fit, and at that point in time, the cupbearer is like, whoa, I remember Joseph, this guy who interpreted our dreams, and it was true. So he goes on to tell the Pharaoh of that situation. Hey, remember that time you threw me and the baker in jail? Well, we met this guy while we were in jail, and he interpreted dreams, and they came true. So, in verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. And they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Notice, Joseph doesn't take credit for this ability to interpret dreams. He has been in jail for 2 years, probably sitting and wondering, God, are you going to answer me? But even though that is his circumstance, whenever he is asked to interpret the dream, the first thing he does is say, God can interpret this dream for you. And not only that, he trusts in God enough before hearing the dream, he says, and God will give you a favorable interpretation. He says, this will be good for you, without knowing what the dream even is yet. He trusts in God that much. Well, Pharaoh goes on and he tells him of these dreams. And so Joseph interprets the dreams and said, these both mean the same thing. They mean that Egypt is about to have 7 years of the best prosperity it's ever seen. We're going to have this wonderful, bountiful harvest. And then at the end of those 7 years, we're going to have 7 years of the worst famine the world has ever seen. So, he gives some bad news. Egypt is about to have this amazingly huge famine. But he also gives a solution. He says to Pharaoh, you should find an overseer that can look over the entire nation of Egypt, and they should collect a portion of the grain throughout this next 7 years when everything's plentiful. So that way, when the famine hits, we can provide for the people, and we can take care of the country, and we will survive. In verse 37, it says, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. See, Pharaoh recognizes, after the failure of the magicians and the wise men of all of that God is different. That something is different about this interpretation. And not only that God is using Joseph to speak these things to him. Through this whole situation, God puts Joseph in a position where he has more influence and more authority over everybody else. And it all came from when he was trusting in God and faithful in prison. That situation is what set up the possibility of this situation. See, you have to realize, he went from being in jail to being the second most powerful person in the world. Egypt at that time was a world superpower. It was the most powerful nation in the world, and now he is in charge of it. He goes from being in prison to being in charge. He's the president of the United States at this point, right? So Joseph, through that, is given more influence and more power and more authority, and he's able to make an amazing impact for God. Imagine if Joseph tried to do that on his own. Imagine if when he was brought out of prison and he's asked, hey, interpret these dreams, he just starts making stuff up. Maybe he's smart enough to trick Pharaoh, right? Maybe he's smart enough to get to this place where Pharaoh's like, hey, that sounds pretty good. I'm going to go with that. But then when nothing comes true, what do you think happens to Joseph? Pharaoh is not known of being a lenient guy. In fact, if you disappointed him, he's probably going to have you executed. Joseph, because he's faithful to God and because he trusts in God, is able to be placed in this position where he has amazing influence. When he relies on God, when the pressure's on, God makes him an influencer for him. Through every tough circumstance, God uses Joseph to change the world, to influence the culture around him. Pharaoh goes from following magic and worldly wisdom to following God's wisdom. That's a pretty big shift. The shift in culture alone is incredible, and it actually sets the stage for where eventually the people of Israel will come and they will be able to be back in a relationship with Joseph. And that's actually where the people of Israel grow and become the nation that one day they will become when they leave Egypt. All set up because the influence that God allowed Joseph to have in that situation. So what does that say then about us in our relationship with God and our role as influencers in the world around us? If we want to be influencers for God, we need to learn how to trust God in the middle of circumstances of our lives. We need to learn to trust that he is with us. We need to trust that we're not alone and that his promises are true. But the only way to do that is with a relationship with God. The only way to come to that place of trusting God is by building our relationship with him. And the only way to have a relationship with God is through a relationship with Jesus. See, Jesus' death on the cross is what allows us to be reconnected with God. Every single one of us has sin in our lives, and sin is what disconnects us from God. It's that thing that interrupts relationship with God. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." All. Every person. Every single one of us. But Jesus was sent to die on the cross so that that sin could be forgiven and we could be reconnected with God. We could have a relationship with God. We just need to accept that sacrifice and choose to follow him as Lord of everything that we are. And when Jesus becomes the center point of our lives, then our relationship with God can carry us through even some of the ugliest things in our lives. It can carry us through things, and not only that, it can allow us to have joy when those situations come up. And I tell you what, nothing can build your influence for God more than when you're able to handle the ugly things of life with joy still on your heart. Because people don't understand how that works. When they see the world around you falling apart and they see you handling it with joy, they start to wonder, hey, what's up with you? God can use that to influence the world around us. There are kind of two situations then that play out in the story of Joseph that I think are really very real-world applications for us in the here and now. The first one that we see is being able to be patient in waiting on God. Joseph had to wait for 2 years to be removed from prison. 2 years. But even in that waiting, Joseph's first response when Pharaoh asks him to interpret the dream is that God is capable of doing this. He doesn't say, I can do it, I can handle it, I can work through this. He trusts in God and that God will take care of it. I think some of you here today have probably been waiting for something to change in your life. You've been waiting for a change in circumstances. Maybe you've been waiting for that promotion. Maybe you've been waiting for that raise. Maybe you've been waiting for your kids to just start listening to you. Maybe you've been waiting for your kids to at least get out of the phase that they seem to be in. Maybe maybe you're a student and you're just waiting for that day that math starts to make sense, right? Maybe you're waiting for that time where you can be reconciled with family or friends and be reconnected. Whatever it is, some of us are waiting for God to show us that he is faithful. But it seems like our prayers aren't being answered, right? It seems like we're in the middle of difficult times and things aren't changing. Maybe it seems like every time you try and pursue an open door that looks like it's from God, it slams in your face. All of us have been in that place where we're stuck in the waiting. We're stuck trying to figure out what that next step is and trying to trust God in those times. Trusting God when things are hard like that can be incredibly difficult. It can be incredibly hard to even wonder if God's still present and God still cares. But what Joseph shows us is the way in which we wait matters. The way in which we spend our time in the in-between where we're trying to figure out what this challenge is and how to get through this difficult situation, it matters. Even when we're waiting, God wants us to be an influence for him. Even when we're in the situations when we don't seem to see the end of the tunnel, God wants us to influence for him. As we said last week, God wants us to embrace our place, to serve the people around us no matter where we find ourselves. Joseph still proclaimed God's power even when he was in prison. And I think we got to be careful not to make the mistake of thinking that since our prayers aren't being immediately answered the way we want them to be, that it's some sort of reflection on God's faithfulness. More often than not, the way in which God wants to answer our prayers is different than what we expect. And it happens at a different time than we expect it to happen. And it almost always is something so much greater than we can ever imagine. The patience we exhibit and the hope that we hang on to when we're waiting can be that very thing that God uses to show the people around us who he is and how great he is. It can be that thing that grows our influence with the people around us and allows us to show them who God is in our situations in life. The other thing that Joseph's story shows us is the opposite of the waiting. It shows us what happens when all of a sudden success happens and boom, we take off. That maybe the prayers are finally being answered. Maybe any number of these things could take off. Life takes off. Joseph trusts God even in the midst of that. It is so easy for us in our busyness when we start to be successful, when we start to have these prayers answered, to be distracted and keep from influencing the people around us for God. Trusting God and allowing our relationship with him to continue to shape our success allows our influence to reflect him. And that starts with giving God credit when we are successful. Handing our success over to God. Because if we seek to build influence just for ourselves, if we all of a sudden find success and we start patting ourselves on the back and we just attempt to build our own kingdom, it's going to leave us wanting. Why do you think it is that almost every single person who ends up becoming a billionaire also then becomes a philanthropist? It's not just because of the tax break. I mean, part of it is the tax break. But it's not just for that reason. It's because they get there and it seems like they have everything in the world and they still feel like something's missing. But if we allow God to be the center of our success, then we can find fulfillment. He enhances that success. We need to trust in God in those times even and recognize that our success is only enhanced by our relationship with him. And I don't think that diminishes the hard work we do put in, right? I've heard this argument recently, which to me seems pretty absurd, where you get some athletes or some famous people or whatever that are proposed with this question of, man, where's God play out on all this? And they step back and go, God didn't do this, I did this. I worked hard, I did all of this. And I think it's easy to fall in that mentality, but when we start to realize that all of our gifts, all of our abilities, even our ability to keep taking breath is centered in God, then naturally we want to glorify him whenever he puts us in a position where we're succeeding and we're growing. One of the ways we can show our influence to the world around us is by giving God glory whenever we succeed and whenever we're in those times when we're placed in a place of position, a place of authority, all of those things. Another way then that we can show our influence and increase our influence in those situations is by responding in godly ways when we're placed in those positions, right? I think of all of the challenging situations that tend to come when you're put in a place of influence. Sometimes that means conflict, right? And I remember recently, not that recently actually, it was a number of years ago, I was working in a team context, and one of our team members was just being a complete jerk to me and to the other people on the team, and it just very abrasive and just a highly challenging thing to be around. And usually in those situations, I like to pull a person aside and have a conversation with them off to the side where they're not like publicly being shamed for their bad attitude or the way they're acting or anything like that. But in this situation, this person was being so caustic to the people around them that I had to call him out in the moment. It's funny because after the fact, another team member came up to me and said, "How were you able to handle that without making the guy feel like an idiot? Like, you were so kind in the situation, and you helped him see that he was off base without completely tearing him down." And I remember responding and saying, "That's not me. It can't be me." And as cliche as it sounds, it was God talking through me, because my knee-jerk response was to bite back. My knee-jerk response was to be a smart aleck and to be a jerk right back to his face. But instead, God used my relationship with him to allow me to respond in a way that was godly, in a way that built him up and didn't just tear him down. And because of that, my influence on my team as a whole increased, because they were able to see the way in which God was moving through me. And because of that, everybody, I think, grew. We are all called to influence the world around us, big or small, in a way that honors God and helps people. We just need to remember that our trust in him and relationship with God has to be the center of the conversation. If we don't allow our relationship with God to be the center of the conversation, then we're only attempting to build up our own kingdom, our own world, our own part of life. God wants us to connect with more people. He wants us to help them understand the importance and the contentment and the hope and the joy and the peace that is found in a relationship with him. He wants us to influence the people in the world around us. So how can you influence your everyday world for Jesus? What people in your life can you continue to show God's grace and faithfulness to? How can you love the people around you that you interact with every day? How can you use those relationships to influence them to be in a relationship with God?
So many of our memories are built through the difficult situations of our past. What are a few that you remember struggling with at the time, but now have come to appreciate or even enjoy? Talk about your history of victories with some friends or your circle this week. What are some of the victorious moments woven into your story that have formed your faith into what it is today? Thanks so much for joining us on the Grand Point Church podcast. Our heart is to help as many as possible on their journey to find and follow Jesus, and we hope you feel at home with us here. Until next time, connect with us on Instagram or Facebook, or feel free to share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you later.